You are listening to PastThink.com audiobook. Please like and subscribe, thank you. Chapter 16. Jia Yuanchun is selected for glorious promotion to the imperial bedchamber. And Qin Zhong is summoned for premature departure on the journey into night. Shi Feng, Qin Zhong and Bao Yu, as we have said, called in at the Temple of the Iron Threshold on their way home. After looking round for a while, the three of them got back into their carriage and continued their journey into the city. Home once more, they first called on Grandmother Jia and Lady Wang, and then went off to their several rooms. But of the rest of that day and the night which followed, our story says nothing. Next morning Bao Yu found that his outer study had now been finished and was ready for use. He looked forward to beginning night work in it with Qin Zhong, in accordance with a promise they had made each other. But unfortunately Qin Zhong's always sickly constitution had been much neglected during their 2-day excursion into the country, and the unwanted exposure to wind and cold and a moderate indulgence in secret frolic with Sapientia had resulted on his return in a cough and chill accompanied by total loss of appetite. Altogether he presented so sorry a spectacle that study was quite out of the question, and they were obliged to send him back home to bed. Although Bao Yu was very disappointed, there was nothing at all he could do but wait for his friend to get better. Shi Feng had now received Yun Guang's reply to the bogus letter, expressing his readiness to comply with her, or, as he supposed, Jiao Yan's, request. Eurygizia communicated this information to the Zhongs, and soon the captain, swallowing his anger and resentment as best he could, was obliged to receive back the betrothal gifts he had sent them on behalf of his son. But Jin Ji possessed a far nobler spirit than might have been expected in the daughter of such mercenary parents. On learning that her affianced had been sent packing, she quietly went off and hanged herself in her scarf. The captain's son, too, turned out to be a young person of unexpectedly romantic notions, for on hearing that Jin Ji had hanged herself, he promptly threw himself into a river and was drowned. The Zhongs and the Lise were thus left in a very unenviable situation. The maid and eke the money gone. In the words of the poet, the only gainer was Shi Feng, who now had 3,000 taels of silver to sit back and enjoy at her leisure. Not an inkling of this affair reached the ears of Lady Wang. Emboldened by this taste of success, Shi Feng from now on undertook many more ventures of a similar nature, far more than we could give an account of in this history. The day of Jia Zheng's birthday arrived, and all the members of the Ningguo and Ronggua households were gathered together to celebrate it. Just as the festivities were at their height, one of the janitors from the main gate burst in on the assembled company. The master of the imperial bedchamber, Mr. Xia, is on his way, sir, with an announcement from His Majesty the Emperor. Jia Shi, Jia Zheng and the rest were taken completely by surprise, quite unable to guess what the meaning of this visitation could be. Hurriedly giving orders for the players to halt their performance and for all traces of the feast to be cleared away, they caused a table with burning incense, which would be required for the reading of the proclamation, if there was one, to be set down in its place. Then, throwing open the center of the 3 main gates, they knelt down in the entrance of the mansion to receive their visitor. Soon Xia Bingzhong, the eunuch master of the bedchamber, arrived on horseback with a retinue of eunuchs at his back. He appeared to have no imperial proclamation or other document on his person, for instead of dismounting, as etiquette prescribed that he should if he was carrying a written instrument, he rode straight on to the foot of the main hall. There, with beaming countenance, he got down from his horse, climbed the steps, faced south and gave utterance to the following announcement. By order of His Imperial Majesty, Jia Zheng is commanded to present himself at court immediately for private audience with His Imperial Majesty in the Hall of Reverence. Having delivered this message, he got straight back onto his horse without staying for so much as a cup of tea and rode away. Still no wiser, Jia Zheng hurried into his court dress and hastened to the palace, leaving Grandmother Jia and the rest in an extreme state of alarm, which they endeavored, unsuccessfully, to allay by dispatching a regular stream of mounted couriers post-haste to the palace to inquire for news. About 4 hours later Lida, the chief steward of the Ronggua mansion, and 3 or 4 other stewards came panting into the inner gate and gasped out congratulations. Master's orders, said Lida between breaths. Will her old ladyship please bring their ladyships to the palace to give thanks to His Majesty for the great favor he has shown us? Unable in her agitated state to remain indoors, Grandmother Jia had been waiting outside in the loggia, whither the others, Lady Xing, Lady Wang, Yushi, Li Wan, Shifeng, Aunt Shui, and the girls, had also congregated to await news of Jiajing. Grandmother Jia called Lida inside to explain his cryptic message in somewhat greater detail. We servants were all waiting in an anteroom, Lida told her, and we had no idea what was going on inside. Eventually Mr. Xia came out and saw us waiting there. Congratulations, he said. Your eldest young lady has been appointed chief secretary to the Empress, and is to become an imperial concubine. Then after that Master came out too, and told us the same thing. I have to go off to the East Palace now, he said, to see the prince. But you must hasten back as quick as you can and tell their ladyships to come to the palace, and give thanks. Lies to information at once dispelled the anxiety that Grandmother Jia and the others had all this time been feeling, and the worried looks on their faces quickly gave way to smiles of pleasure. Now a great dressing up began as each lady robed herself in the costume appropriate to her rank. Then off they went to the palace in 4 sedans, one behind the other, Grandmother Jia's at the head, then Lady Xing's, then Lady Wang's, and then Yushi's. Jiaxi and cousin Jin also changed into court dress, and taking Jia Rong and Jia Chong with them, accompanied Grandmother Jia to the palace as her male escort. There was one person who did not share the unbounded delight now general among the members of the Ningguo and Ronghua households, who behaved, indeed, almost as if he had not heard the news at all. This person was Bao Yu. What was the reason for his unsociable lack of enthusiasm on this occasion? A short time previously the little nun Sapientia had absconded from Watermoon Priory, and made her way into the city to look for Qin Zhong. Qin Bangyi had discovered her, driven her from the house, and given Qin Zhong a beating. The shock and anger of the discovery had brought on an attack of the illness from which the old gentleman was a chronic sufferer, and within only 4 or 5 days he had breathed his last. Qin Zhong had always been of a weak and nervous disposition, and had still not fully recovered from his sickness when these events occurred. The severe beating followed by the overwhelming grief and remorse attendant on the death of his father from anger which he had himself provoked led to serious complications in his illness. This, then, was the reason for Bao Yu's unseasonable melancholy, a melancholy which the news of his sister Yuan Chun's dazzling promotion was powerless to dispel. Grandmother Jia's visit to the palace to give thanks, her return home, the visits of friends and relations to congratulate the family, the unwontedly cheerful bustle of the Ning and Rong households during the days that followed, the general satisfaction that everyone in those households now seemed to feel, as far as Bao Yu was concerned these things might just as well not have been. He viewed them with the eyes of an outsider. The rest of the family merely laughed at him, seeing in this behavior only further confirmation of their belief that he was a bit touched. But then there was Jiao Lian's and Dai Yu's homecoming to look forward to. The advent of the messenger sent on ahead to announce that they would be arriving next day produced the first glimmer of cheerfulness that Bao Yu had so far shown. On being questioned for further details, the messenger told them that Jia Yuan was also returning to the capital to have an audience with the emperor. This was the doing of Wang Ziting, who had recommended him in a report to the throne for promotion to a metropolitan post. As he was both a cousin, albeit a remote one, of Jiao Lian and also Dai Yu's former teacher, it had been resolved that he should travel with them. Lin Ruhai having been laid with his ancestors in the family burying ground, and his obsequies duly concluded, they would, if they had proceeded to the capital by the usual stages, have been arriving back some time in the following month. But when Jiao Lian heard the news about Yuan Chun's elevation, they had decided to make greater speed, traveling by night as well as by day. The journey had been smooth and uneventful. Bao Yu merely asked if Dai Yu was all right, and on being assured that she was, paid no further attention to the man's news. Having waited with great impatience until the early afternoon of the following day, Bao Yu and the rest were rewarded with the announcement Mr. Lien and Miss Lin have just arrived. The joy of their reunion was, however, tempered with grief, because of the 2 deaths that had occurred since their parting, and for a while there was much loud weeping on either side. Then there were words of comfort and congratulation to exchange, and Bao Yu had an opportunity of studying Dai Yu more carefully. He recognized the same ethereal quality he had always known in her, but it seemed to have deepened and intensified during her absence. She had brought a lot of books back with her, and was soon busy superintending the sweeping out of her bedroom to accommodate them, and arranging various objets d'art around it which had also formed part of her luggage. She had salvaged some paper, writing brushes, and other articles of stationery from her old home, which she distributed as presents to Bao Chai, Ing Chun, Bao Yu and the rest. Bao Yu for his part hunted up the rosary of fragrant Indian beads given him by the Prince of Beijing, and offered it as a gift to Dai Yu, but she flung it back at him disdainfully. What, carry a thing that some coarse man has pawed over? I don't want it. So Bao Yu was compelled to take it back again. But let us now turn to Jiao Yan. When he had finished seeing everyone in the family, Jiao Yan returned at last to his own apartment. Shi Feng, though still so busy that she had not a moment's leisure, had somehow contrived to find time to welcome back her wandering lord. Congratulations, imperial kinsman, she said with a smile when, except for the servants, they were at last alone together. You have had a tiring journey, imperial kinsman. Yesterday, when the courier gave notice of your arrival, I prepared a humble entertainment to celebrate your homecoming. Will the imperial kinsman graciously condescend to take a cup of wine with his handmaid? Jiao Yan replied in the same vein. Madam, you are too kind. I am your most obliged and humble servant, ma'am. As they joked together, Patience and the other maids came forward to welcome their master back, after which they served them both with tea. Jiao Yan asked Shi Feng about the events that had occurred during his absence, and thanked her for looking after things so well while he was away. I am not much of a manager really, said Shi Feng. I haven't got the knowledge, and I'm too poor at expressing myself and too simple-minded, always inclined to take a ramrod for a needle, as they say. Besides, I'm too soft-hearted for the job. Anyone who says a few kind words can get the better of me. And my lack of experience makes me so nervous. Aunt Wang only had to be the slightest bit displeased, and I would get so upset that I couldn't sleep at night. I begged her not to make me do all these things, but she insisted. She said I only refused out of laziness and unwillingness to learn. I don't think she realizes even now the state I have been in, too scared to move, or even to open my mouth for fear of saying or doing something wrong. And you know what a difficult lot those old stewardesses are. The tiniest mistake, and they are all laughing at you and making fun, the tiniest hint of favoritism, and they are grumbling and complaining. You know their way of cursing the oak tree when they mean the ash. Those old women know just how to sit on the mountaintop and watch the tigers fight, how to murder with a borrowed knife, or help the wind to fan the fire. They will look on safely from the bank while you are drowning in the river. And the fallen oil bottle can drain away, they are not going to pick it up. On top of that, as I am so young, I haven't got much authority over them, so it was all I could do to prevent them from ignoring me altogether. And to crown it all, when Rome's wife died, Cousin Jin kept coming round to see Aunt Wang and begging her on his knees to let me help out for a day or two next door. I said again and again that I couldn't do it, but Aunt Wang agreed just to please him, so there was nothing for it but to do as I was told. I'm afraid I made a terrible mess of it, even worse than I did here. And now it seems Cousin Jin is beginning to grumble, and says he wishes he had never asked me. When you see him tomorrow, do please try to make it up with him. Tell him it's because I'm young and inexperienced. You might even hint that it's his own fault for having asked me in the first place. While she was saying this, there was a sound of talking in the next room. Who is it? Said Shi Feng. Patience came in to reply. Mrs. Xue sent Caltrop over to ask me about something. I've already given her an answer, and sent her back. Ah yes, said Jiao Yan, apparently pleased by the recollection. When I went to call on Aunt Xue just now to tell her I was back, I ran into such a pretty young woman. I couldn't place her as any of the girls in our household, so in the course of conversation I asked Aunt Xue who she was. It seems that she's the little maid they had that lawsuit about. Cal something. Caltrop. She's finally been given as chamber wife to that idiot Xue. Now that she has been plucked and painted like a grown-up woman, she really does look most attractive. What a waste to throw away a beautiful girl on that great booby. Shifeng made a little moo. I should have thought that having just got back from Hangzhou and Suzhou and seen something of the world, you would have settled down a bit, but I see you are still the same greedy guts as ever. Well, if you want her, there's nothing simpler. I'll exchange our patience for her. You know what cousin Xue's like, always one eye on the dish and the other on the saucepan. Throughout the whole of this last year there have been I don't know how many alarms and excursions between him and poor Aunt Xue, because she wouldn't let him get his hands on Caltrop. It wasn't just her looks that made her concerned for the girl. Everything about her is so unusual. She is so gentle and so quiet. Even among our own young ladies there is scarcely her equal. In the end Aunt Xue decided that if she couldn't stop him having her, at least she could make sure that the thing was done properly, with a party and invitations and all the rest of it. So that's what she did, and made her his chamber wife. But would you believe it, before a fortnight had gone by he had completely lost interest. She was interrupted by an announcement from one of the pages on the inner gate. Mr. Zhen wants you, sir. He's waiting for you in the larger study. At once Jiao did up his gown and hurried out. What on earth did Mrs. Xue want, sending Caltrop here like that? Shifeng asked Patience as soon as he had gone. It wasn't Caltrop, said Patience. I had to make something up and hers was the first name that came to mind. That wife of Bridie's is such a stupid woman. Just imagine, she drew closer to Shifeng's ear and lowered her voice. Of all the times she could have chosen to bring you the interest on that money, she had to pick on the very moment when the master has just got home. It's lucky I was in the outside room when she came, otherwise she might have come blundering in here and master would have heard her message. And we all know what master is like where money is concerned. He'd spend the fat in the frying pan if he could get it out. Once he found out that you had savings, he'd pluck up courage to spend them in no time. Anyway, I took the money from her quickly and gave her a piece of my mind, which I am afraid you must have heard. That's why I had to say what I did. I'd never have mentioned Caltrop in the master's presence otherwise. Shifeng laughed. I was going to say. Why, for no apparent reason, should Mrs. Xue choose a chamber wife to send here the moment master gets back? So it was you up to your tricks, you little monkey. At this point Jiao came in again, and Shifeng ordered her maids to serve the wine, and various choice dishes to go with it. Husband and wife sat cross-legged at opposite sides of the low table on the Kong, and began their drinking, Shifeng with some restraint, although she was normally a fairly hard drinker, in view of the occasion. They had not been drinking long when Jiao old wet nurse, Nanny Zhao, walked in. The young couple at once invited her to drink with them, and tried to make her join them on the Kong. This last honor she would under no circumstances accept, and Patience and the girls laid a little table for her at the side of the Kong, and set a little stool beside it, on which she sat down very contentedly. Jiao made a selection with his chopsticks from the dishes on the table, and after heaping up 2 platefuls, set them down on Nanny Zhao's own little table for her to eat there by herself. Shifeng was critical. Nanny can't chew stuff like that. She'll break her teeth on it. She turned to Patience. That piece of boiled gammon in the bowl I said this morning was so tender, that would be just the thing for Nanny. Why don't you run round to the kitchen and ask them to heat it up for her? Nanny, she said, addressing the old woman, you must try some of the rice wine your Lien brought back with him from the south. Yes, said Nanny Zhao, I must try some of that. And you must have some too, Mrs. Lien. Never fear. As long as you don't drink too much, 'twill do you good. But I didn't come all the way here for victuals and drink, bless you. I came on more serious business. And you heed my words, Mrs. Lien, and stick up for me, because that Master Lien of yours he always says he'll do something, but when you go to see him later, he's clean forgot all about it. To think I reared you up on the milk of my own bosom, Master Lien. And a fine young man you've growed into, thanks be. Well, I'm old and of no account now. But there are these two sons of mine, d'ye see? If only you would be more like a foster brother to them, and look after them a bit, no one would dare say a word against them. But dearie me, I've asked you again and again to help them, and you always says yes, yet to this very day nothing has ever come of it. Well, what I thought was this, Mrs. Lien. With this great blessing of heaven that's come on the family on account of your eldest young lady, surely, I thought to myself, there must be jobs in this for someone. I'll talk to Mrs. Lien about it, I said to myself, because if I rely on Master Lien to help us, we'll starve to death for certain sure. Chiffon laughed. Leave your two boys to me, Nanny. I'll look after them. You know all about Lien's little ways, because you nursed him when he was a baby. He'll give the dearest thing he has to some nobody he's picked up outside, yet his own two foster brothers, who are much nicer young men than any of his favorites, he neglects completely. If only you would take a bit of interest in them, Lien, you wouldn't hear a word of complaint from anyone, instead of wasting your kindnesses on those little male misses of yours. I shouldn't have called them misses, though. You treat the misses as your missus, and give me the miss. There was a loud laugh from everyone present, including Nanny Zhao, who concluded her cackles with a pious invocation. Bless his holy name. Here at last comes a just judge to set all things to rights, but oh Mrs. Lien, those naughty things you said about misses, that's not my Master Lien. It's just that he's so soft-hearted he can't bring himself to say no to anyone who spins him a tale. Soft-hearted with his boy friends, maybe, said Chiffon with a lubricious smile, but when he has to do with us women he is hard enough. Tee, what a one you are, Mrs. Lien. I don't know when I was last so merry. Come on, let's have another cup of that good wine. Now that I've got Mrs. Lien to stand up for me I shall have no more worries. Jiao Lian was by now thoroughly embarrassed and laughed sheepishly. Stop all this nonsense now and serve the rice. I've still got to go round to Cousin Jin's after this to discuss things. Ah yes, said Chiffon. We mustn't make you late for that. What did Cousin Jin want you for just now? It was about the visitation business, said Jiao Lian. Has it been settled then? Well, not absolutely. 8 or 9 parts settled, you might say. That's a great favor of the Emperor's, isn't it, said Chiffon. Something you don't hear of even in plays and stories about the olden days. Very true, chimed in Nanny Zhao. But I must be getting old and stupid, for everywhere these last few days have been abuzz with talk of visitations, but blessed if I can make head or tail of it. You tell us now, just what manner of thing is this visitation? Jiao Lian undertook to do so. Our present emperor, who has always had a great sympathy for the common man, believes that the filial affection of a child for its parents is the most important thing in the world, and that family feeling is the same everywhere, irrespective of social rank. He has found that in his own case, even after seeing the ex-emperor and ex-empress morning, noon and night every day of his life, he is still unable to express more than a fraction of the devotion he feels for them, and this has led him to think of all those concubines and maids of honor and other court ladies, taken from their homes and shut up in the palace for years and years on end, and to realize how much they must miss their parents. And from there he got to thinking of the parents themselves, how they must long for the daughters they can never see again. And then he thought what a crime against nature it would be if any of those parents were to become ill as a result of not seeing their daughters. And so he addressed a memorial to the ex-emperor and ex-empress requesting permission to allow the families of palace ladies to visit them in the palace on the 12th day of every month. When their old majesties saw this memorial they were very pleased and praised the emperor for his piety and goodness, doing heaven's work among men they called it. But they pointed out in their rescript that when the families of court ladies entered the palace on these visits, they would inevitably be hampered by the restrictions of court etiquette in the expression of their natural feelings. Bless my soul, said Nanny Zhao. So that's what it is. Well, I suppose in that case we shall soon be getting ready to receive our young lady? Of course, said Jiao Lian. What else do you think we're all so busy about? If we do receive her, said Shi Feng, it should be an experience worth remembering. I've often wished I'd been born 20 or 30 years earlier, so that the old folk wouldn't be able to look down on me for having missed so much. To hear them talk about the Emperor Taisu's sudden progress is better than listening to a storyteller. How I wish I'd been there to see it all. Ah, now, said Nanny Zhao. That's the sort of thing that scarce comes once in 1,000 years. I was not so young then that I can't still remember. The head of the Jia family in those days was superintendent of shipyards and harbor maintenance in the Suqiao-Yangqiao area, and was chosen to receive the emperor on one of his visits. The way they spent silver on that visit, why, it was like pouring out salt sea water. I call to mind. Shi Feng in her eagerness cut her short. We Wangs received the emperor on one of his visits too. At that time my grandfather was in charge of all the foreign tribute, and the embassies going up to court. Whenever any foreigners arrived, it was always my family that put them up. All the goods brought by the foreign ships to the seaports in Guangdong, Fujian, Yunnan and Zhejiang passed through our hands. Everybody knows that, said Nanny Zhao. There's even a rhyme about it. The king of the ocean goes along when he's short of gold beds to the Nanking Wang. That's your family, the Nanking Wangs. But then there's the Zhens, who still live down that way in Qiangnan. My word. There's riches for you. That family alone received the emperor 4 times. If I hadn't seen with my own 2 eyes, I don't care who told me, I wouldn't have credited it, the sights I saw then. Never mind silver. Silver was just dirt to them. Every precious thing in the world you can think of they had there in mountains. Words like save and spare they just didn't seem to know the meaning of. I believe you, said Shi Feng. I've heard my grandfather talk about it, and he said it was just like that. But it still amazes me that a single family could have so much wealth. I'll tell you something, Mrs. Lien, said the knowledgeable nanny. 'Twere no more than paying for the emperor's entertainment with the emperor's own silver. No family that ever lived had money enough of its own to pay for such spectacles of vanity. While they were chatting, Lady Wang sent someone round to see if Shi Feng had finished her dinner yet. Shi Feng realized that there must be something which demanded her attention, and, finishing hurriedly, rinsed out her mouth and prepared to go. Before she could leave, however, the pages from the second gate announced the arrival of Jia Rong and Jia Chong from the Ningguo mansion next door. Jia Lian had just finished rinsing his mouth, and was washing his hands in a basin held out for him by patients when the 2 young men came into the room. What is your message? He asked them. Shi Feng, curious, stayed to hear. Father sent us to tell you that the uncles have already reached a decision, said Jia Rong. They have measured off an area just over 1/4 of a mile square which takes in a part of our grounds, including the Allsense Garden, on the east side, and the northwest corner of your grounds on the west, to be turned into a separate residence for the visitation. They've already commissioned someone to draw a plan, which should be ready tomorrow. Father says as you've just got home he's sure you must be tired, so don't bother to come round tonight. If there's anything to discuss, you can tell him about it first thing tomorrow. Thank your father for me very much, said Jia Lian with a grateful smile. It is very good of him to let me off tonight, and I shall do as he says, and not go over until tomorrow. I think the great advantage of this proposal is that it is so economical, and makes the job of construction so much easier. It would mean very much more trouble if we were to build on land outside, yet at the same time we should lose the convenience this present scheme gives us of a single layout. Tell him when you get back that I think it is an excellent proposal, and that I leave it to him to protest in any way he thinks fit if the others show signs of going back on it. The one thing we must under no circumstances do is to go looking for land outside. Anyway, I shall be round to see him first thing tomorrow, and we can talk about it in detail then. Jia Rong promised to retail this message. Jia Chong now stepped forward with a message of his own. Uncle Jin has given me the job of going to Suzhou to engage music and drama teachers, and to buy girl players and instruments and costumes, so that we can have our own theatricals for the visitation. I'm to take Lai Xing's 2 sons with me, and 2 of great Uncle Zheng's gentlemen, Dan Pingren and Bogushio, are coming as well. Uncle said I ought to have a word with you about it before I go. Jiao Yan looked the youth up and down appraisingly and laughed. Do you think you are qualified for the job? It may not be a very big one, but I should say the pickings would be pretty good for someone who knew the ropes. Jia Chong laughed too. I shall have to learn as I go along. Jia Rong, who was standing somewhat away from the light, availed himself of the shadow's concealment to give Shifeng's dress a surreptitious tug. She understood perfectly well what his meaning was, but pretended not to, dismissing him with a curt wave of the hand, and addressing herself instead to Jiao Yan. Don't be so officious, Lien. Cousin Jin is no less capable of choosing the right person for the job than we are. What do you mean by asking the boy if he's qualified? He's as much qualified as any of the rest of us. He's old enough to have seen a pig run, even if he's not old enough to have eaten pork. In any case, I'm sure Cousin Jin only chose him as a figurehead. You don't seriously suppose that he'll be the one to discuss prices and deal with the business side of the expedition? I think myself it's a very good choice. Of course it is, said Jiao Yan. I don't dispute it. I merely thought we ought to do a few of his sums for him before he goes. Where is the money for this coming from? He asked Jia Chong. We were discussing that just now, said Jia Chong. Gaffer Lai says that there's no point in taking money with us from here. He says the Jins of Qiangnan hold 50,000 taels of ours on deposit, and he can give us a letter of credit to take to them when we go. We'll draw out 30,000 first and leave the rest to buy lanterns, lamps, and curtains with later on. Jiao Yan nodded appreciatively. Good idea. Well, if that's all settled, Shifeng put in quickly, I've got 2 very reliable young men for you to take with you, Chong. I'm sure you'll find them extremely useful. What a coincidence, said Jia Chong. I was just about to ask if you could recommend a couple of helpers. He asked for their names, and Shifeng turned to Nanny Zhao to supply them. But the old nurse was so bemused by all this talk of policy and high finance that she appeared to be in a sort of coma, which it took a sharp nudge from Patience to rouse her from. When she answered it was in a gabble, to make up for the awkward pause. One of them is called Zhao Tianliang, the other is called Zhao Tiandong. Mind you don't forget, said Shifeng. Now I'm off to see to my own affairs. And she left the room. Jia Rong slipped out after her. If you will make a list of all the things you want, he said, smilingly and softly, I'll see that he gets them for you, gracious lady. Gracious arsehole, said Shifeng. Do you think you can buy my favor with a few knickknacks? I don't like all this whispering in corners. She walked away without giving him a chance to reply. Meanwhile Jia Chong was making a somewhat similar proposal to Jiao Yan. If there's anything I can get for you while I'm away, uncle, I shall be glad to wangle it. My, said Jiao Yan. Let's not get carried away, then. I must say, for one who's only just started, you certainly haven't lost much time in picking up the tricks of the trade. Yes, I dare say I shall write and let you know if I find I'm short of anything. With these words he sent the 2 young men back to the other house. Their departure was followed by a succession of 3 or 4 visits by servants reporting on household matters, after which he felt so exhausted that he instructed the servants on the inner gate to refuse admittance to any others and to inform them that he would deal with their business next day. It was midnight by the time Shifeng got back to bed. But the affairs of that night are no part of our story. Rising early next morning, Jiao Yan first called on his father and uncles, and then went to the Ningguo mansion, where, with cousin Zhen, he joined a group consisting of the older stewards and domestics and a few friends and clients of the family in making a complete survey of the Ningguo and Ronggua properties with a view to deciding where the various buildings of the separate residents should be sited. He also helped them interview the craftsmen who would undertake the work. After the assembling of builders and artisans, the assembling of materials began, a continuous flow of supplies converging on the site from every direction, from precious consignments of gold, silver, copper and tin, to huge, bulky loads of builders' clay, timber, bricks and tiles. Various walls, including the surrounding walls of the Alsense garden, and some of the garden's pavilions were demolished, so that the northwest part of the Ningwa property, and the large open court on the northeast side of Rongwa House were thrown into a single site. A range of servants' quarters on the east side of the Rongwa grounds had already been demolished. The Ningwa and Rongwa properties had previous to this been divided by an alleyway running from north to south between them, but as it was not a public thoroughfare, no problem was involved in closing it and incorporating part of it in the rest of the new site. The Alsense garden had been watered by a stream led in by a culvert, which ran under a corner of the north wall. Now that the garden was being integrated in the larger site, it was no longer necessary to lead the water in at this point. The artificial hills, rocks, trees and shrubs of Alsense garden were, of course, insufficient for the whole of the new site, but the area occupied by Jiashi was the original garden of Rongwa House and plentifully supplied with bamboos, trees, rocks, pavilions, kiosks and pergolas capable of being moved elsewhere. By pooling the resources of these two gardens, the Alsense garden of Ningwa House, and the original Rongwa garden where Jiashi lived, and redistributing them over a single area, it would be possible to make great economies in both labor and materials, and when the estimates came to be made it was found that the requirements, in terms of completely new materials, would be comparatively modest. The conception as a whole, and the designs for its execution, were alike the work of a well-known landscape gardener familiar to all, and sundry by the sobriquet of horticultural Hu. Jiajing was unused to matters of a practical nature, and left the management of men, and the control of operations to a consortium consisting of Jiaxi, cousin Jin and Jiao Yen, the stewards Lida, Lai Sheng and Lin Jixiao, the clerk of stores Wu Xian Deng, and two of his literary gentlemen, Zhang Guang and Qing Rixing. The digging of pools, the raising of hills, the siting and erection of lodges and pavilions, the planting of bamboos and flowers, in a word, all matters pertaining to the landscaping and layout of the gardens, were planned and supervised by horticultural Hu. Jiajing would merely drop in occasionally when he got back from court and look around. On any important matters he sought the advice of Jiaxi and the rest. Jiaxi led a life of cultured ease and never did anything. On routine matters of no great importance, cousin Jun would either report to him in person or send him a brief note when the thing was done. If consultation was unavoidable, he would send along Lida or one of the others for a reply. Jia Rong's sole task was to supervise the making of objects in gold and silver. Jia Chong had already left for Suqiao. Cousin Jin, Lida and the rest were the ones who did most of the real work. It was they who hired workmen, kept accounts, and supervised and inspected each job as it was undertaken. The amount of noise and activity generated by these operations could not be described in a few words, and for the time being we shall not attempt the task. The family's recent preoccupation with these important developments had released Bao Yu from his father's periodical quizzing about the progress of his studies. Unfortunately, the relief of mind which this would otherwise have afforded him was displaced by a grave concern for Qin Zhong, whose sickness seemed to be daily worsening. Under such circumstances it was impossible for him to feel happy about anything else. One morning, just as he had finished washing and dressing, and was thinking of going round to grandmother Jia to ask if he might pay Qin Zhong another visit, he caught sight of Tea Leaf dodging about behind the screen wall of the inner gate, and evidently trying to catch his attention. Bao Yu hurried over to him. "What is it?" "Master Qin. He's dying." Bao Yu was stunned. "Dying? When I saw him yesterday he seemed quite lucid. How can he be dying so soon?" "I don't know," said Tea Leaf. "But that's what the old gaffer said just now who came round to tell me." Bao Yu hurried back and told grandmother Jia. She instructed some of the more reliable servants to go with him and briefly admonished him before he went. "When you get there you may stay with him to the end, since you have been such good friends, but you must come back as soon as it is over. Don't hang about." Bao Yu hurried off to change, only to find, on re-emerging, that the carriage was still not ready. Anxious lest he should arrive too late, he ran up and down the courtyard in a frenzy of impatience, imploring the servants to make haste, and when it at last arrived, he flung himself in it and drove off at great speed, hotly pursued by Li Gui, Tea Leaf, and the others attending him. The house, when they reached it, appeared silent and deserted. Entering together in a tight little knot, master and servants surged through like swarming bees to the inner apartment at the back where Qin Zhong lay, causing great consternation among the 2 aunts and half-dozen girl cousins who were tending him, and who were unable to conceal themselves before the advent of this masculine invasion. At this stage Qin Zhong had already lost consciousness several times and, in accordance with the northern custom, which forbids a sick man to breathe his last on the Kong, had some time since been lifted on to a trestle bed to die. Bao Yu gave an involuntary cry when he saw where he was lying and broke into noisy weeping. He was quickly restrained by Li Gui. "You know how delicate Master Qin is. I expect the Kong was too hard for him, and they have put him here, so that he can lie a bit more easy. You mustn't cry like that, or you will make him worse." Bao Yu held back his sobs and drew close to his dying friend. Qin Zhong's face was waxen. His eyes were closed tight, and he seemed to breathe with difficulty, twisting his head from side to side on the pillow. "Jingqing, old fellow. It's me. It's Bao Yu." He called him several times, but Qin Zhong seemed unaware of his presence. Again he called. "It's Bao Yu." In point of fact, Qin Zhong's soul had already left his body, and the few faint gasps of breath in his failing lungs were the only life that now remained in it. The ministers of the underworld, armed with a warrant and chains to bind him with, were at that very moment confronting him, but his soul was refusing to go quietly. Remembering that he left no one behind him to look after his family's affairs, and bethinking him of poor Sapientia whose whereabouts were still unknown, he entreated them most piteously to spare him. But the infernal visitants had no ear for his entreaties and silenced him with angry rebuke. "You're an educated young fellow, haven't you heard the saying? If Yama calls at midnight hour, no man can put off death till 4? We ministers of the netherworld, from the highest down to the lowest, all have unbending iron natures, and, unlike the officials of the mortal world, who are always doing kindnesses, and showing favors and inventing little tricks and dodges for frustrating the course of justice, we are incapable of showing partiality." Suddenly, above their angry shouting, Qin Zhong heard a tiny cry. "It's Bao Yu." At once he renewed his entreaties. "Good gentlemen, be merciful. Give me just a moment for a few words with a very dear friend of mine, and I'll be back directly." "What is it now?" asked the demons. "What friend?" "I won't deceive you, gentlemen. It's a descendant of the Duke of Ronghua. His name is Bao Yu." "What?" screamed the officer in charge of the party in great alarm. He turned angrily on his demon minions. "I told you we ought to let him go back for a bit, but you wouldn't listen. Now look what's happened. He's gone and called up a person full of life and health to come here right in our midst. This is terrible." The demons showed signs of disarray on observing their leader to be so affected, and there was some angry muttering. "Your Honor was putting on a brave enough show a short while ago. Why should the name Bao Yu throw you into such a state of commotion? If you ask us, seeing that he's upper world and we're lower world, there's nothing to be afraid of. We might just as well carry this one off now and have done with it." The trepidation of their leader, who was perhaps thinking more of Bao Yu's demon-repelling talisman than of its wearer, was far from comforted by this reflection. "No. No. No," he shouted, and compelled them to let the soul return to its body. With the return of his soul, Qin Zhong regained consciousness and opened his eyes. He could see Bao Yu standing beside him, but his throat was so choked with phlegm that he was unable to utter a word. He could only fasten his eyes on him and slowly shake his head. Then there was a rasping sound in his throat, and he slid once more into the dark. What followed will be told in the following chapter. You are listening to PastThink.com audiobook. Please like and subscribe, thank you.